Sophie, and this is Kids in the Kitchen.
I'm Abby. I'm AJ. Happy 98th birthday, Great Grandma. Ooh, nice touch. I'm Tabitha. I'm Nick. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Morgan.
This is our illustrious chef here on Kids in the Kitchen, Jim Terry. What are we making today?
We're going to make something that was a suggestion from staff and crew members working with fruit, which is something we haven't really emphasized much in the duration of the show. And to have a great, delicious food. A food, not merely a beverage, but something that actually is nourishing. A real energy boost because of the natural sugars that are in there is a bonus. So we're going to be producing a smoothie today. A smoothie which comes from the antiquity of Evanston, Illinois, the Blind Faith Cafe's version of a fruit smoothie. Let's go get some ingredients.
We've got some very special guests here on the set of Kids in the Kitchen.
That's right, Morgan. We have a second grade class joining us today.
Where are you guys from?
Yay! You guys are going to help us open the show. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kids in the Kitchen!
Before we start cooking, we have to start shopping. In this segment, our show is called Shopping with the Chef. We filmed Kids in the Kitchen at a Hy-Vee store, and this is Megan Dawson.
Hi, AJ. Welcome to Asbury Hy-Vee. I hear it's your great-grandmother's birthday.
Yes.
Megan Dawson is a registered dietitian. Are you busy?
Very busy. I help all kinds of people in Dubuque community. I work with our customers. I work with different adults within the community and kids.
Jim, what are we making and what do we need?
We need a wide variety of foods because we're making a bunch of different things that will hopefully appeal to a broad base of you folks here today and at home tomorrow. So we're going to be getting some fruits, which was based on a suggestion of some of you, which is a great idea, and we're going to produce some kind of a fruit smoothie today.
I missed you.
You know, I was just trying to get a handle on the unexplored transom of my brain, and it occurred to me that your great-grandmother is 98 years old, and that is a really long life. How do you think she got there?
She ate very well.
Outstanding. Indeed. And an underlying policy that we've kind of adhered to unspoken on the show is that if great-grandma didn't cook with it, and you can't pronounce it, why are you eating it?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Shopping with the Chef.
Let's see, what are we looking for? Okay, the melon, the fruit, maybe. Want to get a couple? Get a couple. Now hold on, let's check very gently. You want to pick them up, measure them with their eyeballs. You don't want to be squeezing them and crushing them. You want to treat them real good. If they're hard as a rock, they're probably not going to have the thing, but you don't want them to be all soft and squishy either, and you don't want to damage them at the same time. You got something that gives a little bit. It does. It's got a little bit of give, which we're looking for. We could get a couple of these just for fun. Oh, yeah, that's a goodie too. It's just got that very slight yield. Yeah. Should be good. How are we doing here? I think that's good. I think it's enough. Let's take a beat. Thank you for doing that. That are not bizarrely tropical tasting. They're very recognizable. Well, gently, right? They're not potatoes. You have to be very careful. They're fruit, so you want to handle them like a baby. Absolutely right. That's good. Yeah, get a few of those. We want to get that orange citrus aspect. We also want to get some frozen organic blueberries are a really wonderful addition to that, as is lime. A squeeze of fresh lime juice. Well, we have our kiwis, which might cover that. Strawberries would be okay if we can find some. If we can get some organics and look good, let's check it out and see. We'll see what's out there. This really isn't really the season, but hey, you know what? Apples are useful, but we might be using some apple juice to put in there to give it its slurry-ish nature. Let's see what we got. Let's see what's over here.
We love having Kids in the Kitchen at Hy-Vee. We are the world's biggest pantry for kids in the kitchen.
Megan, I heard you're working on some pretty big projects.
That's right. We have Live Healthy Iowa. It's a 100-day challenge to promote nutrition and health and fitness with adults and also the kids. We're also doing a Go the Distance Day with the 4th graders in the Dubuque community. So it's a great, great program, and we're glad to have it here.
So Jim, what do we have so far?
Well, we have some bananas, which are not as ripe and sweet as I would like them to be, but I think these are going to be useful. And we also have some really nice looking organic raspberries. These are a bit of a luxury, but hey, and periodically during the course of the year you might well have some canes in your backyard that are sprouting tons of raspberries, black raspberries. Maybe we have a lot of those in this region. I'm telling you right now, black raspberries in a smoothie. And look what we got. We got some kiwis to give a little bit of that kind of strawberry flavor, because actually kiwis are related. Even though they look like a completely different sort of a critter, the flavors are in that zone.
Aren't they also known as gooseberries, Jim?
Well, they're Chinese gooseberries, technically. And in New Zealand, they call them kiwi fruits, but they're actually Chinese gooseberries, which are very different from the gooseberries that grow in this country and in England. And clementines, which have a really nice sweet citrus flavor and more minimal amounts of pulp, holding the globules together.
Yummy.
They are delicious. So we're going to have some of those and maybe a few other things too, but I want to get some frozen organic blueberries, because they're not really in season right now, and the frozen ones add a nice crispy thing. And we also need a lime. So we need, that's the hugest, look at this thing, it's as big as an orange. It's gigantic. So we're checking also, we're looking to see, are they by the each or are they by the pound?
Do we want like what kind of each?
We want something that's nice and juicy.
$2 for $1.
50 cents a pop, huh? Wow. 2 are going to be plenty. Let's do it. Thank you. It's just a squeeze, just a spritz. This is a little bit of an amalgam program today, because we're trying to put some staples into the refrigerator for quick access, for rapid fire nutrition any time of day, particularly in the morning when it is so critically important. But the inspiration for the fruit smoothie came from staff here, just discussing the idea of having fresh fruit on hand and how fast and easy it is to work with. This particular kind of smoothie that we're making today had its roots in the way that they made it in the old days at the Blind Faith Cafe, which still exists to this day as far as I know in Evanston, and they produce some very tasty food using natural whole ingredients. We're looking for frozen blueberries because they're kind of critical, but if we don't have them, we can do something else.
Harvest berries, which probably has some.
Yeah, there might be a combo.
Cranberries.
Wait a minute, see. It's over here. Those are vanilla pie. Those, yeah, right in the back, all the way in the back. Thanks. Fantastico.
Are frozen blueberries better to buy in the off-season or just all the time for more consistency?
Well, it really depends on what you want to accomplish. If you can get fresh organic ones, go for it. But fruits in particular, it's usually better to go for the organic option if you can. I mean, I like to believe that it's always better to go for the organic option, but in some foods it's more critical, like potatoes, like strawberries in particular, because they just absorb so much and they hang on to so much of the toxins and impurities that are part of their massive production process. Organic stuff doesn't have those residues. It's better for you. So I'm sticking to that. And with blueberries too, I think it's pretty important to go for organics, and this is what we have right now. These are what are available to us. And even if they're in season and they're fresh, I recommend freezing them first, because they just add a really nice crunchy icy bit, because you don't want to add a whole bunch of ice to your smoothie because then they get too crispy and too watery, and we want them to be kind of luscious, unctuous, and thick.
I love my blueberries unctuous.
Exactly. So, what else we require? We have the blueberries and stuff. Juice. We need some juice. And look! Oh, water flavored food.
And
we're looking for actual juice, which is here. So, there's all kinds. If we could buy, you know what's really, really good? If you have nectarines or peaches, actual juice that has peach or apricot in it. Oh, it's an iced tea. We want something. Yeah, we want something that actually has more. Let's see, saw a mango peach. But I'm trying to avoid avoid as many tropical things as I can.
So peach or what?
Apricot. Apricots are really good.
Here's pear.
Yeah, that would be really good too. Pear juice might be nice. Strawberry lemonade. Apple's good. Organic apple juice is kind of a basic standard. That's really good and it's readily accessible. Apples grow around here. Let's do that. It's a classic. We have all those other flavors from the other things. And you see how there's gunk at the bottom? Yeah. That's because it's unfiltered. It's just squoze and apples. It has been pasteurized so it's stable, because otherwise it's sugar, of course, and what would happen? It would ferment, it would explode, and it would get really bad tasting even if it didn't explode. So we want this to be like it is.
Apricot.
We're good. Seriously.
Apricot next year.
Ooh.
We could get a small one.
Now, nectar usually means that it has a bunch of sweeteners added to it. Nectar is not juice, and nectar usually means that it's full of stuff. Can you read the ingredients on here and tell me what's in there? What's in it?
Ingredients: water, apricot puree, and sugar.
Yeah. Well, I'd really rather not have sugar, and also it's rehydrated from apricot concentrate. It might taste all right.
There's some small stuff too.
Yeah. This is pure juice. I'm ready to go with that. Let's do it. Oh, I got another one. I only eat that kind. It's all I So, what we want to do, prep these puppies and get them in the freezer right away. We shall review our ingredients. Behold, we have here the organic frozen blueberries from Cascadian Farms, the juicy sour limes, which are so aromatic and such a wonderful nuance. To drink a whole bowl of lime juice would be really possibly unpleasant to the uninitiated. Although I used to eat these along with sticks of butter when I was 2 years old. I don't recommend it. Not good for the digestion. So I'm told by family members. These are the Chinese gooseberry, marketed very cleverly as kiwi fruits by the primary market producer of New Zealand. And then here, the Knudsen apple juice, a long-time producer of natural juices that don't have anything in them but the mentioned juice itself, organic apple juice, and appropriate for us because apples grow around here. Not so the banana, which we cannot really successfully grow too well around here, although the trees can be grown as an ornamental thing in your parlor, atrium, or hothouse. Fresh, organic raspberries. It's hard to beat, and they're going to add some wonderful flavor. And some crunchy seeds. Anybody have a problem with the crunchy seeds being in there? No. Cool. Sometimes, seeds can be an issue sometimes for people if they have one of the idiopathic digestive tract disorders. Idiopathic, look it up. And then we have clementines. A citrus fruit of delicious flavor and aroma.
Yummy.
Morgan will introduce the appliances necessary for producing the smoothie. Morgan, take it away.
You're going to need a blender, some measuring cups, and some sharp knives.
Excellent. So, let's prep our fruits. What we want to do first with some of these things, we want to wash them, or in the local vernacular, wash them in the zinc. Highly recommended. Let's keep our blueberries frozen while we're prepping, and there's really minimal prep to do. It's so fast and easy. You have to throw those in the freezer. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get our oven on. Just automatically. The oven must go on.
He was joking about the oven. We're not using the oven in this episode.
We might have, but not today. Our knives, we'll keep those on hand. We need to slice let's wash everything, because several of those items are commercial. We don't know what's been sprayed on them. We don't know where they came from. So if you'll wash the exteriors, when we're cutting them and prepping them, we'll be pushing the waxes, the other substances on the outside into the fruits that we want to be eating.
Jim, do we really have to wash fruits that we're going to peel?
It's really not a bad idea, because stuff is on the exterior, particularly on commercial fruits. You have no idea what they've been sprayed with at any point along their process of production, shipment, and then final arrival at the store. So it's usually a good idea to get whatever's on there off of there. As Morgan pointed out, with the citrus fruits, oftentimes oils, waxes of various sorts are used. Most of them are considered food grade, of course, so they wouldn't be on there, they wouldn't be permitted. But because of the sourcing from unknown markets all over the world where rules are not as stringent, it's just a good policy to wash them. Because they're oils and waxes, water isn't going to take it off. So using a very mild natural hand soap like we use here is a good idea to get that stuff off.
Jim, if we're doing a lot of food, can we just put it in the dishwasher and put it in the rinse cycle?
Because it's so hot, it would probably be a bad idea, but I will tell you, I know for a fact that a local restaurant, because of the sheer amounts of produce, lettuces in particular they were using, were allowed a dedicated washing machine for spinning their produce dry, and the health departments agreed as long as it was used only for that. It was specifically in their prep area. It was never used for clothing or anything else. It was a dedicated washing machine that spun all the produce dry. Seriously. It worked. want to peel off the skin of the kiwi, but we don't want to lose everything that's there. They're pretty small, and if we cut real deep, most of our berry is going to be gone, because of course the greater the surface area that you're losing, it's not a good thing. So we just want to peel off the furry skin. I'm sure, like soft-shelled crabs, real hardcore kiwi eaters just eat the whole thing with the skin and the pith and the pulp and all that. Interestingly, you know how strawberries have their seeds kind of on the outside? The kiwis, they're kind of distributed on the inside, but when you cut it open, if you cut a strawberry open and you see that sort of radial arrangement of fibers and filaments in there, it's actually very similar when you cut open a kiwi. But we're going to peel off the skin. You see it's just pretty much like peeling a tater, and this knife, this bird's beak knife, is what they call this. Isn't that an interesting shape?
Yeah.
It's not sharp enough that it's going to cut. You can actually draw the knife towards your thumb, and you're not using enough pressure that you're going to hurt yourself, because you're not building up pressure this way. It's very, very soft. And once you cut off that initial skin, you're right there at the surface and losing minimal amount. Like so.
Okay.
I know you will do well. So, if we need the lines to be sliced in half. Oh, we need the segmenting of the clementines. So, another knife. I think there's a little knife over here. Sorry. That's a snake knife. Let's put that over there. How's this one? Better? How sharp? Ooh, it's kind of serrated. So, we can just kind of get it started. We want to cut just, oh, look how juicy. We just want to go in about that far. You see how I'm using the blade of the knife to kind of show me how far to go in? Because I don't want to cut deep into the segments or globules. There's a wonderful story to be read. You can probably find it online by a Scottish poet-author who's recently deceased named Ivor Cutler. And his tale of father bringing home an orange from the market is worth the price of admission. It's only one page. But read it and savor every word. It's brilliant. And he describes the orange and how the aromas suddenly fill the room. Are you getting that? Anybody salivary glands going right now? Smelling it? Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And this, of course, is a clementine, not an orange. But look, and you see how the skin is much thinner? Look how thin that is. You don't have that gigantic, thick skin like an elephant like that with all that pith. This is really excellent ratio of juice to overall volume. That's pretty good. So what we want to do is get the skin off of it, and I'm sure you guys can all do that. Is currently using the term guys to refer to an indeterminate aggregate of human forms considered a pejorative? Is anybody insulted by the use of that word? Hey, you guys. We used to be just guys, but now that word is commonly used for a group of people. Is anybody insulted by that, or is that something we don't do these days? Because time marches forth, and I could be wallowing in the 1990s for all I know. Okay. Yeah, look at that. You see they just come right open. Now what you can do, too, is draw off that little bit of pith in the middle and segment it out this way. Yeah, really pretty good. You could really do a lot worse. Now what we would do at a high-end restaurant, you produce what is known as a supreme. A supreme is where you actually take the surrounding material off the exterior, and they come out looking like sort of like those canned mandarin orange segments. And you want to, but that's really just for display, and also because it's just all juicy, wonderful goodness then. But if you want, you can do that at home. We won't worry about that here because we're going to buzz these puppies right up. All right, check it out. Now, is that considered good? I'm not getting a lot of juiciness off of it. Well, let's see how it goes. Work with those, open them up, see how they are. We want to cut our lines in half. Who's got a knife? Who hasn't been underutilized? Cut them along the equator, right? Does that make sense? Hear what I'm saying when I say that? Want them to be cut? No, that's along the longitude. Exactly right. We want the equator. But go ahead and use that. That's lovely. We'll take the edge off. Because we are moments away from commencing our production.
100 years ago, oranges were so special they were given as Christmas presents.
There was no practical refrigeration methods to transport fruit across the country.
And so today we take fresh fruits for granted.
Everything is coming along beautifully. Beware of the point of your knife sticking up towards somebody's face. It's about 8 inches away from someone's eyes. So you really have to watch that down always. Yeah, you got to watch out for that. Very dangerous. Okay. Now, one thing that we have to do, which is terribly important, which people oftentimes don't think of, they just start throwing stuff into their blender. What was in it before, and was it removed, cleaned properly, all that stuff? Take a peek inside. Give it a sniff. Even if it was you that cleaned it out the last time, who knows? It's likely aromatic, but that's all right. There's always going to be residual aromas because rubber and plastic are used. They have memories. They remember smells. You know, that old jar lid, you know, they've put through the dishwasher 100 times. It still smells like salsa, peanut butter. You know, those aromas hang around. So let's get a little bit of ice going in there, just a bit. Woo-hoo. Our bananas are nearly frozen. That's actually really good. So Will someone please bring them forth? Or even first, we're going to do our TVs later. I forgot about that part.
Jim, I'm concerned about the clementines. They seem kind of dry.
They do. It's paradoxical. A fruit, you know, with a nice looking exterior, you open it up and inside the globules just aren't bursting with juice. Something's up with them. Don't know why they're like that, but they are like that. They're not ideal. They smell pretty good, but they don't have the amount of juice. The juice to pulp ratio is not what we're seeking for this. So we are going to do something else. We've got some organic orange juice from the good people at Organic Valley who have sourced excellent quality fruit, and that will give us that sweetness and that lusciousness from an orange type citrus fruit that we're looking for. So let's have some of that. Plus we got to have our apple juice. Let's get this all rolling. We're going to throw in our frozen blueberries from Cascadian Farm because they're, oh, so good. Something like that. Oh yeah, we got to have some of that. And then we're going to save our kiwis for later. That's a shoe. And we already have those. We need the juice. And we're going to be checking our consistency. We can always add more ice to make it frostier. We can add another banana to make it creamier. The bananas are actually sort of our ice cream here. The goal here is to actually make something really, really helpful, which, of course, in the past, on many episodes of the show, we do favor a certain amount of luxury, just for fun. But this is something that is so good. Oh yeah, it's all been pigmented by the berries that are in there, and the blueberries really make it, give it a deep color. Okay, so we will adjust this as need be, but we gotta have the spritz of lime because that gives it that ineffable perfume.
I love ineffable perfume.
Actually, that would be a very good name for a perfume. Ineffable. Why not? Okay.
Because most people can't pronounce it.
Yeah, that gives it a certain amount of attractiveness in itself. Let's start with mixing.
What if it has
Oh, nice. And now? Look at that motion. Now, you see how it's not really flying up into the air? And in honor of the birthday of Edgar Allan Poe, who basically invented the detective story, this is a bit of a reprise of A Descent into the Maelstrom. Wow. Check it out. Now, I think we need... Okay, it did come back slowly. It's pretty creamy, but I think we could use a little more lusciousness, don't you think? Maybe a little more ice. If you want to get a little more banana, let's get a little more banana. You got to have that. Look, oh, that's actually not bad. That's not bad. What about what? That's for the next batch. Because I want somebody not to have them. I know that we didn't actually establish a real allergy, but it might be nice to. Give me like a half a banana, a broken piece. That's good. Excellent, excellent. Activate. Energize. Suburb. Oh.
Captain, we need more power.
You cannot change the laws of physics, Lassie. I've got the thing cross-wired like a Christmas tree. Okay, we got a smoothie. Let's get some little cups out and see if you like it like this, and then we can adjust it as need be.
Jim, could we also freeze this and have it as an after-school snack?
Oh yeah, you can put it in those little pop trays there where you put your little sticks or plastic tabs in there, and you fill the vessels, the reservoirs of this, because it's not going to be like ice cream. When you freeze it, it's going to be really, really hard. But it's icy, but they're excellent. They're really good that way. They work. All right, try it. Who's going to be our taste tester? Hold on. Who suggested in the first place? Somebody suggested smoothies? It was you. Try this. See what you think. Ooh, it's shake-like. Look at that. Talk about unctuous. Taste first, and then we pour. Have you had worse?
It's good.
It is good. It's been approved. Behold.
It's been approved.
You try. Oops. Sorry. We're dribbling everywhere. Beware. You try. And then we'll see what difference a kiwi makes. Well, it has a little bit of acid, and that's important. Acid good. That's the ascorbic acid, which helps you. The ascorbic acid and the attendant bioflavonoids are what contribute to excellent skin elasticity, good vision, all of those things. Your cell health, your mitochondrial health.
It has a nuance to poke.
Well said. And I think that will do that for this one. We'll keep one. If someone please return that to the freezer. We'll get a few more raspberries in there. And of course, most of you know that whenever you're having fruit, any kind of fruit dessert, really the emphasis lately has become the sugar that is used to enhance it. I knew an old guy who was just a fantastic guy. He subsisted almost entirely on raw hamburger, which he really liked, and strawberries, which he was very proud of. I eat a lot of fresh fruit. He lightened it with sugar. He didn't want the strawberries. He wanted the strawberry to be a vehicle for all of the sugar that he put on top. So beware. If your taste buds start getting accelerated like that, does anyone here know what being velocitized is? Anybody taking driver's ed yet? You're too young for driver's ed, isn't that right? Yep. Well, velocitization is the experience of driving on a highway at 55 or 65 miles an hour and then getting off the off-ramp and feeling like you're crawling, and because you're not concentrating, you're talking to somebody over here, you're looking for directions, you're trying to find an address, you suddenly find yourself doing 45 in a 30-mile zone, and the guy behind you has the lights going and you're pulled over. You've been velocitized. And that's a common occurrence. It happens to people a lot because they can't control that. They just kind of stay in the mode of being on the highway. It happens to your taste buds. Our taste buds get velocitized. We're constantly pumping them with new, louder flavors, which are broadcast in big type on the front of all the packages of snack foods. More salt, more flavorizing agents, which they pay people a lot of money to develop new ones all the time. So beware. It's war out there. And if you're not vigilant, you will be taken over by that kind of stuff. And pretty soon, natural flavors of food will not be enough, and you must constantly have bigger doses of more flavorized food. So ramping it down and eating natural stuff in as close to its natural form as you can without constantly being hyped by sugar. Check it out. Look and see how many of the foods that are in your home are not amped up with stuff that really doesn't need to be there. If you can stand this, and if you can enjoy it, and apparently it is good, I think it is, reset. You'll find a cornerstone for your taste buds. Reset your palate. It's really useful to do. A plain piece of really good buttered toast. It's hard to beat, particularly when you're really hungry. As they say in Spanish, they say something Spanish in Spanish, I don't know how to say it. But it translates out to, the best sauce is hunger. Not starvation, but real hunger, real appetite. Instead of just dosing yourself periodically with stuff from a machine to kill the hunger pangs, eat something really good when you really have an appetite. That's why exercise is so important. You always have an appetite then. You know what it's like when you're training in the summer, when you're playing a lot, when you're doing sports?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have a real appetite. And food tastes fantastic then. A kiwi. Yes, let's do it. In fact, it'll probably take it all right, but if we can slice it into smaller pieces, it's really, really helps. So we got a knife on the go? Excellent.
This must have been the easiest episode we've ever done yet. So, Jim, are you going to put the recipe on the website?
Well, the basic concept is right here. As close to frozen bad as you can get, juices of the kind that interest you, the fruits that are maybe available and in season that you might particularly like, some other things, some stone fruits like peaches or apricots would be awesome in this, ripe pears, apples, anything you like, pineapple, anything that you like. Put it in there, buzz it up. It's this amazing tool that almost everybody has in their kitchen that can really turn something so simple as fruits into something special and festive. You can eat the fruits on their own, and that's wonderful, but doing it like this makes it really fun. What we noticed was, touching these kiwis, they're kind of gloppy. They're a little mucilaginous, which sounds disgusting, but it's actually lovely, and it's one of those things about foods that we like. Okra does that to gumbo, but I think this is going to actually add a really lovely texture. Too many of them might actually make it a bit gooey. This, I think, will make it actually a little bit thicker. Let's try that much and see how it affects the flavor. Ensign, bring us out of hyperspace. Excellent. The right stuff.
And that's how we make fruit smoothies on Kids in the Kitchen. I'm Nick.
I'm Sophie.
I'm Tabitha.
I'm Morgan.
I'm Sarah. I'm Abby.
I'm AJ.
And I am Jim Terry. Thanks to the crew who suggested this. This was a great idea. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Kids in the Kitchen.
evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Nesmith. I'm a professor of political science at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our speaker, Chuck Marohn, who will give his famous curbside chat. I want to thank the sponsors of tonight's speech, who are Coe College, the Iowa City Area Development Group, the MPO of Johnson County, and the University of Iowa Initiative for Sustainability. I also want to thank John Thomas and John Shaw, who are not here, but who did most of the work of setting this meeting up, and also Brandon White of the Corridor MPO. Chuck Marohn is the president and co-founder of Strong Towns, which has a great web presence, which I trust you will talk about. He lives just north of Baxter, Minnesota, which is near Brainerd, with his wife, 2 daughters, and 2 Samoyeds. Chuck is professionally trained both as an engineer and a planner, receiving degrees in both from the University of Minnesota, and has consulted over the years with dozens of towns across Minnesota on infrastructure projects. And the process of doing that and the experience led him to see connections between the standard practices of infrastructure building and the financial crises many towns faced after the 2008 implosion and continue to face. He will be sharing some of those lessons with us tonight in the curbside chat. And with no further ado, Chuck Marohn.
You know, you guys have been so generous already. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming here. Just so the people who arrived, not late, arrived on time, but before our pre-discussion, I've been directed to stay in the light, which is this little area right here, because they're videotaping this, so I will be doing that. Thank you for showing up. My name's Chuck Marohn. Our organization, Strong Towns, is a nonprofit. Our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. Back in 2008, after working as an engineer for a number of years, as working as a planner for a number of years in cities all over Minnesota, I just was fed up with everything, right? I started to write. My outlet, instead of breaking things or yelling, is writing. And so I started to write a blog, and I tried to talk about and answer a question that I didn't know the answer for. Why are our cities going broke? Why, despite having decades and decades of the most robust growth that humanity has ever experienced, why me living in this very high growth area where our cities had had lots and lots of growth and development, why were we still unable to find the money to do just basic things? Why could we not keep our potholes filled? Why could we not fix our sidewalks? Why could we not keep the weeds out of our parks? Why, like the basic things, were we unable to do? And not only in 2008 when everything started to go bad, because they actually didn't go bad for cities for a couple of years. Cities are on kind of a budget that has a slower reaction time. But even when we got to 2008, we had had years where cities were just struggling even with huge amounts of growth. Why? And tonight I'm going to show you some of my answers to that question and some of the things that we can do differently with our cities and our places to not only make them financially strong and resilient, but better places to live. I want to start this whole conversation by having you think about the way cities were designed and built thousands of years ago. These are 2 artist renderings. The one on the left is a little city called Ur in the Fertile Crescent, like 6000 BC. It's the oldest known place we've excavated. The one on the right is, of course, ancient Rome. These are places that were designed and built around the dominant transportation technology of the day, that, of course, being your 2 feet. The people who lived in these places walked everywhere they went. The layout, the design, the spacing of different things, all of this was based around a civilization of people who walked. Fast forward thousands of years. This is my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. I live 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is what it looked like back in 1904. People would arrive by train, they would arrive by stagecoach or ride by horse. But when they got to the city, what would they do? They would walk everywhere they went. So very much like these ancient cities, these were designed around people who walk. The spacing, the distance between buildings, the difference between different types of uses. All this was based around a society of people who walked. Beginning in the early 1900s and then accelerating after World War II, we began to build cities around a different transportation technology. We began to build cities around the automobiles. We came up with different building types, different building styles, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. This has become very normal to us. And if you ask anyone today to describe this transition, they'll generally describe it in terms of progress. We used to be a people who walked everywhere. We build cities around people who walk. Now we are people who drive everywhere, so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people with jet cars. And someday we will teleport, and we will build cities in a completely different way, right? That's a very comforting and affirming way to think about this transition. It's a narrative of progress. I want to put an idea in the back of your minds as kind of set the stage for the entire conversation we're going to have tonight. When you look at these places, understand that by the time we get to ancient Ur, people had been experimenting with how to build places for thousands of years. They had been trying different things. What worked, they would keep and expand on slightly. What didn't work, they would throw out and not copy. And by I mean didn't work, I mean people died, things went bad, right? Little experiments over time to try to figure out how to build a place that would endure. By the time you get to these places here, we had thousands of years of practice. Thousands of years of practice during periods of drought, during periods of flood, during periods of war, during periods of peace, in periods of plenty, periods of having little. By the time we get to my hometown in the early 1900s, we had a way of building that was universal around the world. And you can go to different latitudes, different cultures, different civilizations. And this way had been tested and adapted to all those different places. When you get to this style of development, even though this seems very normal to us, it seems almost like this is the way things have always been done. It's important to understand that we've only been doing this a very short period of time. The knowledge on how to do this was not gained by trial and error experimentation. We didn't try this out in Illinois, right? For 100 years and then like watch what those crazy people did and take what worked and bring it here to Iowa and Minnesota, right? We just reshaped an entire continent all at once in a generation. It's important to understand that what seems like normal pattern of development is really a massive, massive experiment. An experiment that no civilization in history has ever tried before, particularly not on a continental scale. But we are. And we're all the guinea pigs in this big, big experiment. The ways we finance growth and development has changed along with our adoption of this experiment. Well, if you go back 100 years, growth, development, jobs were all a byproduct of things we were going to do locally. Transition with the Depression in World War II, that became a joint state, federal, local project. Now, at the local level, when we want to finance growth and development and new investment, we generally use these three methods. The first is a transfer payment between governments. The idea that the federal government, the state government as our partner, comes up with grant programs, tax subsidies, different kinds of things to induce and create growth at the local level. The second is DOT spending. The idea that we invest in transportation systems. These not only create jobs while things are being built, but they also create a platform where we can have more growth. We put in the frontage road, we put in the interchange, we get the Walmart, we get the housing subdivision, we get the strip mall, we get the restaurant, we get all those things that go along with it. The third mechanism is debt. And while public debt is a very important part of this conversation, the ability of local governments to take on accelerating levels of debt, Even more important than this is private sector debt. The ability of individuals to get long-term financing, have that financing sold off onto secondary markets, drive down the interest rate, have it be securitized, bought up by pension funds around the world, which creates an enormous amount of liquidity that we have used to grow and grow and grow. We use these mechanisms to create growth at the local level, and of course, at the local level, when we get new growth, we get new tax revenue. When we get that new store, when we get that new housing development, when we get that new gas station, we get additional revenue. This is kind of city administration 101. It's important to understand the incentives that are at work here for cities. When we get new growth through one of these mechanisms, when we get a federal grant, when we get a state tax subsidy, when we get a DOT project, when the private sector comes in with leveraged debt, generally, as local taxpayers, we pay a very, very small portion of that transaction. We may have to upsize a pipe, we may have to pay a little bit of money to expand a roadway, but generally in cash out of pocket, we pay very little. The revenue that we get, however, is substantial. Now there's all this new growth, all this new development, all this new tax revenue coming in. The catch is that as part of these transactions, we agree to take on the long-term maintenance and the long-term obligation to serve all of these places. We agree that we will fix all the pipes, all the pumps, all the valves. We'll maintain the roads and the streets and the sidewalks. We'll provide fire protection and police protection and schools and every other service that will be needed. We are, in a sense, exchanging a near-term benefit in cash for a long-term liability. If you think this through over a long period of time, in other words, if you think back to ancient Rome and you say, you know, Chuck, maybe we won't be around thousands of years, but I would certainly hope that we'd be around more than a generation or two. We're going to be around 50 years, 100 years, maybe 200 years. There's only one of two ways that our strategy makes any sense. Either growth is going to continue at ever-accelerating rates. In other words, we're always going to be able to generate that much more new growth that we can use to make good on all the promises we took on in the prior generation. Or our model of development is actually going to generate for us more wealth than it does in cost. Now, I think everybody in this room intuitively understands that the first assumption is not true. I mean, it's not mathematically possible, but we've experienced enough this in our economy to know it's not true. Unfortunately, the second assumption is also not true. And this is where, for a brief moment, this presentation will get a little bit technical. I am an engineer, so I have to do a little bit of that. I'll walk you through it. It won't be painful, I promise. One of the things that we did early on at Strong Towns was start to look at developments where we could get a real understanding of what was going on. Often, you know, cities are such complex places, and when we do a development, there's all these little things that attach into it. So we look for parts of the system that were really kind of independent, so we could dive in and get a sense of what the economics of our places were. This is probably the simplest kind of development you'll ever see. This is a dead-end cul-de-sac. These are 2.5 to roughly acre lots. The only infrastructure here is the dead-end road. This was built in the mid-1990s. The city wanted it paved. It was a gravel road. So the city went out and paved it, and the property owners paid half the cost. The city paid the other half. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city's collecting from the people that live within this development, the only people that really use the road in any substantive way, how long will it take the city to recoup the half that they just spent to fix the road? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road won't last 37 years. And understand that when the city goes out to fix it, when it does fall apart, that's entirely a city cost at that point, right? That's not going to be a cost shared with these property owners. Here's another development. This one was built in the mid-1980s. You see there's a closed-loop, dead-end cul-de-sac. These are a little bit smaller lots, half-acre, three-quarter-acre lots. These over here are a little bigger, but they've got a small amount of frontage. By the mid-2000s, this one had completely fallen apart. The city went out to fix it. The cost, $354,000. We asked the question, all right, based on the taxes we're collecting from the people who live within this development. Now, remember, this is just a residential development. There's no commercial traffic, no through traffic, no chance of any future expansion. This is just a road that serves the people who live there. How long will it take the city to recoup the money they just spent to fix it? The answer is 79 years. The road won't last anywhere near that long. So we ask the question, all right, if between now and the time the road fell apart, the city tried to raise enough money from the people that lived here to have the money to fix their road, what would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with an annual increase of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, I get it. We know we lose money on our residential property. We make it up on commercial. Commercial is our cash cow. To which my gut reaction always is, all right, I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does and tries to make it up in the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would think that was a good strategy. Nonetheless, we've kind of adopted that as an acceptable way of doing business. This is a high-end commercial development. This is the kind of build it and they will come investment that we do to attract kind of the higher-end type of commercial investments. This is a business park. It's got the wide industrial streets, the sewer, water, curb, everything done to the hilt to attract businesses. This was built in the mid-1990s. This place is completely built out today. Every lot is occupied. We asked the question, all right, the city was looking to say, this is so successful, we want to build it again over here. We're just going to build the exact same thing on property owned next door. Would this be a successful project if we could invest the same amount of money and get the same amount of private investment? In today's dollars, it would be $2.1 million. There's $6.6 million of increased property value out here that occurred. Now, pause for a second and understand that in this business park today, 4 of the lots belong to a church. 2 of the lots belong to the school district. It's their bus maintenance facility. 1 of the lots is a county maintenance garage. 1 of the lots is a city maintenance garage. Of the remaining lots, the ones that theoretically would be private sector taxpayers, every single one was either sold for $1 and or received a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move to this park. For the sake of our analysis, we assumed that the entire new business park would be built out within 1 year, that every single entity that moved in there would be a full tax-paying, non-subsidized business, and that every penny of new revenue would go to repaying that debt. And it would take, under that wildly optimistic scenario, almost 3 decades, 29 years for the city to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would need to go up to pay to plow the snow off the streets and mow the ditches and provide police protection and fire protection and every other service that would be needed. And that's in a wildly optimistic scenario. Back in the early days, I used to go through, because I have like 25 of these examples, I used to go through them all. And after like a while, people started to just cry. I don't do that anymore. If you're someone who wants case studies, our website, which I'll give you that address at the end, has a bunch of these. I found I can make the point with just 3 examples. Everybody kind of starts to get it. Let me walk you through what's going on. And again, I apologize for being an engineer. I like charts and graphs. There's 4 charts in this whole presentation, the next 4 slides. I will walk you through them and then we'll be done with the geek stuff, all right? Let's say that a developer comes to our community, says, I own a piece of land I would like to build. I am willing to follow all of your codes and regulations. I'll follow all your ordinances. I'm not asking for any variances. I'll build exactly what you've asked to be built on this site. I will, with my money, build all the infrastructure. I'll build the roads and the streets and the sidewalks and the curbs and the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters and everything that's needed. I'll build it. I will build all the homes. I will build all the commercial properties. I will build everything. And when I'm done building this, the only thing that I ask of you, the public, the city, is that I be allowed to turn it over to you to maintain. What would you say? You'd say, yeah, double thumbs up, right? This is like the greatest deal ever. You mean we pay nothing We get all this stuff for free. This is an ideal scenario, right? But let's say that we're prudent people, good Midwesterners. We've heard of the strong town stuff. We want to do the right thing. So when that revenue from that new development comes in, we take that portion that would normally get spent other places maintaining stuff, and we just set that aside. And every year when that money comes in, we set that portion aside, and we allow it to accumulate so that when we get out a generation or two from now, we've got a pot of money that we can use to fix all this stuff, to make good on the promise that we made when we do this transaction. Here's what that looks like. In year one, revenue comes in. We take that portion, we set it aside. Year two, money comes in. We add to what we had in year one. In year three, we add a little more. In year four, a little more. And you can see every year we add a little bit of revenue. You go out, in year five, a brand new street doesn't cost you anything. Year 10, brand new pipe doesn't cost you anything, right? Year 15, the sidewalk's not cost you anything. So this whole period of time, you're just bringing in more and more and more revenue. By the time you get a couple of decades out, you've got quite a pot of money. The problem is, when you get to, in this example, year 25, and you have to actually go out and fix something, what you find is that the cumulative amount of revenue is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments, a collection of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple years after that first development, says, that worked out really well for me, worked out really well for you. I would like to do the same thing on this other piece of land. And in fact, every other year from this point forward, a developer comes in with a similar size proposal. In other words, the ideal scenario for any city, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on our promises. Here's what that looks like. In year one, you've got your first development that starts to pay in. In year three, you add a second. Year five, you add a third, and on and on and on. And you can see, not only does our cash grow rapidly, it actually starts to kind of accelerate upwards. We have growth upon growth upon growth. And when we get to year 25, and we have to make good on that very first promise we made way back in year one, yes, we've got to spend a little bit of money, but it's okay, right? It's not a big deal. We've got it. We've had all this growth. This is what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is why our cities who have done everything right, have followed all the rules, did everything the way they were supposed to do it, still find themselves with no money. This is why our cities who have, planned, executed, done everything as diligently as they could, still wind up in a future where they don't have any money to do anything. We have a model that doesn't work, right? And it's easy to understand why. I mean, there's a term here. Boy, now I'm going to forget the psychological term. Is it cognitive discounting?
Dissonance.
No, it's not cognitive dissonance. That's being able to hold two conflicting thoughts in your brain at the same time. It's cognitive discounting. It's why people smoke, right? I smoke because smoking brings me some benefits. Oh my gosh, I've got emphysema, right? We value the benefit today more than we fear the pain tomorrow, right? It's why I'll have the ice cream tonight instead of go exercise, right? Cognitive discounting. It's a human thing. There's one more graph I want to show you, and it explains how this experiment has been carried out more than the 50 years that we've been doing it, and it's this graph of debt. Everybody in this room understands the conversation we're having at a national level about our debt, right? We're approaching $20 trillion of federal debt. This is a massive amount of money. We're hearing all this stuff now about Greece and their debt as a percentage of their GDP. Debt, 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 debt. It's this huge, huge deal, right? In this chart here, that huge amount, this blue line here on the bottom, that's the growth in our public sector debt. That's the growth in that massively huge number. The black one here, that's the growth in our GDP. This green one, the one that soars up like that, that's our private sector debt. That's debt that we all share. That's home mortgages, commercial real estate loans, auto loans, credit cards, margin interest accounts, student loans, private sector debt. The way we funded the first generation, the first life cycle of this new suburban experiment, this new way, this exciting way of building and transforming an entire continent, was to take our savings and that illusion of wealth and reinvest it back into more growth. When that wasn't sufficient to keep everything going, when the liabilities started to add up, when things started to slow down and become more difficult, think mid-70s to early 80s, right? It took us a while to figure out what to do, but we eventually shifted from an economy based on growth through savings and investment to an economy based on growth through debt accumulation. And as we cross into the third generation, the third life cycle of this new way of building, growth through debt accumulation became such an important part of keeping our economy going that we actually allowed it to become predatory. We needed the growth so badly that we didn't care if you didn't have a job, couldn't make the payments, couldn't make a down payment. We allowed our system to prey on our neighbors because we needed the growth so badly. Our ability to continue to have the private sector amp up their leverage in order to keep this experiment going is just not feasible. Obviously, there's some huge implications to all of this. The mechanisms of growth that we become accustomed to are waning. The federal government, the state governments are disinvesting to a degree in local governments. You can see a long-term trend of less money flowing from the federal governments to local governments, less money flowing from the state government to local governments. The DOTs are functionally broke. Your DOT commissioner today, in a meeting that I was in with ULI in Des Moines, said, and I'll paraphrase him now, but I'll have the exact quote on our blog next week. He said, "We have more lane miles in Iowa than we will ever have money to maintain. This means that many of our highways, many of our bridges will simply go away. They can go away through neglect or they can go away through intention, but either way, our system is going to contract." This is something every state has. We have built more than we have the ability to maintain. Our private sector is stretched. We are not going to borrow accelerating levels of cash in order to keep all this going. This means for our cities, for our local governments, that we are going to be forced to absorb the costs of our development pattern. If we want that road fixed, we have to pay for it. If we want that pipe repaired, that money has to come from us. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some massively large tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. Now, I didn't come here to tell you what you already know, right? Is this a conversation you're having here? It's a conversation everybody's having everywhere, right? How big is the tax increase going to be? Who's going to pay for it? How deep is the service cut going to be? And where is that going to be felt? This is the conversation going on at every level of government, everywhere in this country. It is critical that we see the third variable in this sentence, the third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in a way that is functionally insolvent, There is no way our cities are going to avoid insolvency. As long as we continue to develop in a pattern and an approach that gives us an illusion of wealth today in exchange for massive long-term liabilities, there's no way that our cities are going to avoid default. Whether that is a hard default, like we see in places like Detroit and Stockton and San Bernardino, or whether it's a soft default, like we see in thousands of cities around this country, where they're laying off police officers and firefighters, where they're not maintaining parks, where they're deferring critical maintenance year after year after year. We have to start to have a conversation about how we build cities that are financially more productive. So how do we do this? And way back, I've been giving a presentation similar to this for 5 years now. Way back when I started off, I found myself in California, traveling the state, and I would give this presentation, and we get to the end. We're going to talk the rest of the time about how we think differently about our places. And I would get to the end, and someone would always stand up and say, "Chuck, I'm really angry with you. You came here, you scared us all the heck, and you never told us what the solution to this problem is. I want a solution." And it took me a while to grasp what I was being asked. I was being asked, what is the solution? But what was really being asked of me was this: what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? Right? There's no such solution, right? We've tried all those things we thought would work. We have created for ourselves, in this experiment, this transformation of a continent, we have created for ourselves a very complex set of problems, a complex set of problems that defy a simple solution. What we talk about at Strong Towns is not solutions. We talk about rational responses. How will intelligent, thoughtful people living together in a community roll up their sleeves and rationally respond to this complex set of challenges? That's what we're going to talk about the rest of tonight. When I start thinking about rational responses, I automatically go back to this photo here. Again, this is my hometown back in the early 1900s. When I first saw this photo, I was just blown away. I was just blown away. As a planner, I look at this and I'm just amazed, right? The way the buildings line up, the way they frame the public realm at just the right Greco-Roman ratios to provide that sense of place. The buildings themselves have great symmetry. They front the public realm. There's great segmentation of space. This is an amazingly brilliant design. Let me ask you a few questions about this place here. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees did they have to go to get approval to build something? How many federal and state subsidies did they get? How much tax increment financing did they give to their businesses? How many miles of infrastructure did they build to induce people to move there? How many stadiums? How many convention centers and libraries? How many economic development officials? How many engineers and planners did they have on staff? We can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves in our suburban experiment are so critical to creating prosperity, yet they had none of them. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages, right? Look at the place they built. This was a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. How did they do this? It's really, really simple. They took the materials they had at hand and they did what they knew worked. They took what they had and they copied a pattern of building and development that they had seen work for thousands and thousands of years. After 2+ generations of engineers and planners and economic development officials telling cities all the things they should do to create growth and prosperity, after all the federal grants and the state subsidies and the DOT investments and everything that we've done to create a better America, here's what this exact same street looks like today. It's a wasteland of parking and half-occupied buildings. And if you want to understand in one photo why our cities are struggling financially, know that there's $500,000 of public infrastructure in that little stretch of street right there. Where's the wealth to maintain that? Where's the wealth to maintain that generation after generation after generation? I was giving a lecture a couple years ago at a university in Boise. And when I showed this slide, a student raised their hand, stood up and said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build the way that you do. When we build in Costa Rica, we have to build one block at a time. And before we can build the next block, we have to make sure that every space on the block we just built is filled in. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way.
Okay, I think we're ready to convene our regular work session for August 21st, 2018. Troy, are you going to start? Dr. Barnum, hi. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good evening. First of all, the chief would very much like to be here. He had planned to be here. He forwarded me some opening remarks. Due to a procedure that he had done last week and the death of his father, he's not able to make it tonight. He's actually ushering family back for funeral service arrangements. I'd like to reintroduce you to Dr. Christopher Barnum. He's the Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice and Director of Graduate Studies Masters in Criminal Justice at St. Ambrose University. He has presented to the council before. Many of you are personally familiar with him. Today he's going to present on the 2016 and 2017 analysis by his group of our traffic data, our traffic stop data. And again, the chief had prepared some opening remarks. I apologize that I'm just going to read these, but I think it's important that you hear them in his words. The Iowa City Police Department's collected demographic data on traffic stops since 1999. The first analysis was in 2004, entitled Traffic Stop Practices of the Iowa City Police Department, January 1 through December 31, 2002. The research team was from the University of Louisville, and this report was frequently referred to as the Louisville Study. In 2006, the ICPD hired Dr. Christopher Barnum to conduct an in-depth analysis to better understand operational trends in the department. The goal was to reduce the traffic stop disproportionality and gain the confidence and trust of our community, especially the minority community. Dr. Barnum conducted an analysis on data from 2005 to 2012 and presented the results to the Iowa City City Council on June 16, 2014. He presented the 2015 data analysis results on April 19, 2016. Dr. Barnum met with some Iowa City Police Department officers in 2014 and 2016 to explain his methodology and the results of his study. According to then Iowa City Police Chief Sam Hargadine, the officers asked concerned questions and were genuinely interested in the results of the analysis. Concerns nationwide about police misconduct and the perceptions of police by the entire community do weigh heavily on the minds of the officers. It is my belief that the Iowa City Police Department officers continually strive to improve the ways in which they serve. In 2015 and 2016, ongoing professional development included training specifically on race-based traffic stops, implicit bias, and diversity. In 2006, ICPD officers received training in diversity, discrimination, and cultural competency. Titles of some of these classes were Affordable Housing Conference and Working Together in a Diverse World. All officers received training in fair and impartial policing and bias-based policing via online courses. In January 2017, Police Chief Matherly was hired and immediately implemented a strategy to address disproportionate minority contact. It consists of three components. One, education and training. Courses in cultural competency increased from 257 hours in 2016 to 1,132 hours in 2017. Additionally, a $450,000 grant was obtained to address gender bias in police work, specifically investigations. Two, Community outreach. While the ICPD continues a tradition of successful community policing strategies, the department has enhanced its problem-oriented policing and increased involvement in social organizations and community groups. The goal is to educate the public and continually reassess what the community wants and expects from their police agency. And finally, number 3, deployment of resources. We continue to develop robust intelligence systems so crime trends can be quickly identified and communicated to patrol officers. To simply saturate minority neighborhoods, stop drivers for minor violations, arbitrarily search vehicles for weapons and drugs does not statistically produce more results than stopping white drivers. Such tactics do nothing more than erode trust within the minority community. Instead, officers are encouraged to conduct traffic enforcement in areas where high crash rates occur and address residents' traffic complaints. In late 2017, an Iowa City Police Department committee was formed to develop strategies to reduce disproportionate minority contact, increase community trust, improve internal communication and education regarding disproportionate minority contact, and develop creative and supportive ways for officers to be more effective at their jobs. One of the committee's initiatives is the Bulbs program, a partnership with local repair shops to help those who cannot afford to repair burnt-out lights on their vehicles by replacing the bulb for free. Such a program can have positive impact and alleviate fear that drivers may get stopped for defective equipment and have their vehicles searched. Emphasis has also been placed on the recruitment of minority candidates for police officer positions to more accurately reflect the racial demographics of the Iowa City community. Finally, there is more work to do in addressing disproportionality in traffic stops, according to the St. Ambrose study results that Dr. Barnum is about to present for 2016 and 2017. However, in 2017, there was a significant reduction in the disproportionality in outcomes, such as citations and searches, which is encouraging. The Iowa City Police Department will continue to identify where disparity exists that we have influence over and address it in a fair and consistent manner. Again, I wish Chief Matherly was here to present that to you himself. I know that he would like to be, but with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Barnum to present the data analysis for 2016 and 2017.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm Chris Barnum from St. Ambrose, and I will present the data that we've been collecting. We've actually been working with Iowa City for quite a while now, and some of you have seen my presentation before. So since I have 2 years worth of data, instead of going through each year piece by piece, which might be kind of time consuming, what I'll do is kind of highlight the important areas, highlight our methodologies so you have a good understanding of how we do our work. And then I will point to the areas that I think are probably the most important and significant of what we found in the study. And of course, if you have any questions, you can ask me. And I think probably the best way to ask me is just to ask as I'm presenting the data rather than waiting to the end, because that'll save some time that way. So when we do work like this, and we actually are working with several communities, so we're starting to get quite a bit of experience and expertise at doing this. What we look for are 2 essential features in police data. So when you do an analysis like this, what we do is we kind of divide it up into 2 basic processes. The decision to make a stop is the first one, the officer's decision to make a stop. That's the tricky part. And then the second part is the outcome of the stop, what happens after the stop occurs. That part's a little more straightforward because we don't have we have a fixed data set that we can compare there. So the tricky part about the first part, the decision to make a stop, is what we do is we get the data from the police department, and we'll look at percentages based on racial categories. So what percentage of the stops were African Americans, what percentage were white, what percentage were Asians, and so forth. And then we have to compare that to something, and now that's the tricky part. It's tricky in several ways. First of all, most communities are not homogeneous in terms of racial composition across the geographic area. And so if stops are made more in one section of town than in another, then you have to go where the stops are being made to figure out what the percentage of the racial composition of the drivers on the roads are in those areas. So we spend a lot of time in the communities we work with going out and establishing what we call benchmarks. And what that is we actually go out and watch the traffic. And my grad students do it, actually. I don't do it. What they do is they look at cars and they try to determine the race and gender of the drivers, and they just keep a tally. And then we compute the percentages of different racial categories on the roads that we see in specific areas of town based on what the grad students see. We also then try to validate that by looking at census data and some other things. But we've been doing traffic observations now in Iowa City for nearly 10 years, and we're doing them right now. We're continuing this process right now. My students will be down here again this weekend, and we're in the neighborhood of over, I don't want to give you a hard and fast figure, but I know the last time I counted we were approaching 70,000 observations. So we've watched a lot of traffic here. So that's sort of the methodology. So the hardest part of doing this type of work is the first part. Looking at the police data on the decision to make a stop and determining, do the numbers differ from what we think they should be based on the benchmark values that we see. So on the screen now is kind of how we do this. So that's obviously a map of Iowa City broken out by 1 square mile areas. And what we do is we track the stops made in each of those squares, and then we go to the ones that have the most stops made, and we really focus on watching traffic. And we watch traffic both during the day and at night, on weekends, football weekends, and so on. So we try to get a good benchmark that way. And so, I'm going to skip to this slide right here. So each of these little squares are numbered, and when we get the data from the police department, the stop will indicate which location it occurred by that number, so we can track where the stops were made. And so if I go back to the previous slide, you can see that this slide shows, and this was actually from 2016, but 17 is very similar to this, that most of the stops are made in one area of town, zone number 21, and that's downtown. That's the downtown area. So of the 12,000, almost 13,000 stops made in that year, over 6,000 of those stops took place downtown. And then, so zone 29, which is, let's see if I can get this mouse to work. Yep, right there, is right here. That's the second most place. That would be immediately south of downtown, sort of like the Broadway Cross Park area. And then adjacent to those areas were also areas that had quite a few stops made. So this map that I have on here now shows you the areas where the lion's share of the stops were made by the Iowa City Police Department. Zone 21, the downtown zone, by far had the most, and that was true across days, nights, weekends, whatever. And then second highest was zone 29, which is immediately south, the area I just talked about. And then the other two areas also had, in comparison to other areas, relatively high numbers of stops. So at this point, since I've already given you a lot of information, would you like me to go back and show you that previous slide so you can look at that again with the bars, or are you, this one right here, or are you comfortable with me moving forward? Okay. So what we do then is, now that we know where the stops are generally being made at, that's where we really focus on doing traffic observations. So we go out, and my grad students set up at different locations throughout those 1 mile areas and do exactly what I said. They watch traffic, and they record the race and gender of the drivers that they see according to their perceptions. And then we cross-validate what they see. So each of them rotate through the same location, so I can check and see if pretty much all of them are seeing the same thing. Generally, we have a rather high correlation between observers in the neighborhood if you used a correlation coefficient of 0.8 or above, so they're all seeing pretty similar things through the intersections that they're watching, which gives us some confidence that our benchmarks are probably stable at least, and hopefully valid. Now, we're currently in the process of watching traffic again this year because there was some indication in the last 2 years in the data that maybe the benchmarks were changing. So the analyses that I'm going to show you tonight are based on benchmarks that we've already established, but keep in mind that we're watching right now to see whether those benchmarks are indeed valid. I have a feeling, although it's too early to tell, that maybe the benchmarks have creeped up a little bit. And what that would mean is if the benchmarks have changed, then the level of disproportionality that we see might be a little bit too high based on the old benchmarks. So that's why we're looking to see right now. So this gives you this was information up to 2015. At that time, we'd made about 56,000 observations, but like I said, we've been watching again, so we're probably in the neighborhood of pushing around 70,000. And you can see we're watching certain areas a lot more than other areas, which makes sense because that's where most of the stops are being made. So what we do essentially is we establish a benchmark for the city in general, which is 10%. 10% of the drivers on the roads, we argue, are minority drivers, except in the areas that we watch extensively, and then we use our benchmarks in those areas. And we base our benchmark in the other areas off census data. So in areas that we've watched, and again, these are subject to change because we are currently updating. During the day in the downtown area, this slide breaks out actually what we saw. So our benchmark there indicates that it's 7% of the drivers were minority drivers. We usually won't go below 10%, so we use 10% in the analyses. And then at night, it changes. So we saw more minority drivers on the roads at night than during the day, which is typical for what we find when we look at this across different communities, at least in Iowa. And so in the downtown area, our benchmark is about 18% at night. And so then that area just south of downtown, the Broadway Cross Park area, during the day, it depends on where you're at there. That's a very interesting area. So certain areas are higher than 25%. Certain areas are quite a bit lower than 25%. But an overall average for that square mile area is about 25% of the drivers on the roads there are minority drivers. That's during the daytime hours. And then at night, it bumps up to about 32%, so about a third of the drivers. So zone 30 would be the area immediately east of the Broadway area. So as you move east from there, both days and nights, our benchmarks are at 17% for that location. And then 28 would be the area immediately west of the Broadway area, and that what we found there was about 14% for both days and nights. So now it's a simple matter. Statistically speaking, what we do is we take the police data, compare the stops made in those zones percentage-wise to our percentages that we say are on the roads, and any difference is known as disproportionality. So disproportionality, just as a word of caution, doesn't necessarily mean bias or that the police were doing anything wrong. It simply means that there's a difference between the percentage in their data and the percentage in what we say the benchmarks are. It's possible that there could be due to socioeconomic reasons. There could be differences in driving populations in terms of equipment violations on cars and so forth, which could lead to disproportionality. So there is a possibility for legitimate reasons for disproportionality to occur, but bias is also a possibility. So it's the whole gamut. Y'all with me? And then this caveat that one thing to really keep in mind about when you're observing traffic like this is that essentially we're taking a sample of drivers on the roads as we're watching, and like any sample, there's sampling error associated with that. So our benchmarks could be off by a couple points. And so that's why when I analyze data like this, I don't get too hung up on the absolute difference between percentages. What I like to look at are changes in data, and then I really like to look at individual officer data and see if any individual officers are different than the others. I think that gives you a better idea of really what's going on. And so those are the things I'm going to highlight in the data here. So just briefly, I'm going to run through these slides fairly quickly. Please stop me if you have any questions. This was 2016. For days, you can see the same pattern occurs that I just showed you for the entire department. Most of the stops are made in the downtown area, followed by the other areas. You'll notice, though, they make a lot fewer stops during the days than they do at night. So they make a lot of stops at night, relatively few stops during the day, but the pattern of where the stops occur is very similar. Okay, so this slide then shows disproportionality based on the zones where most of the stops are being made at. So the red bar represents our benchmark, and the blue bar represents the percentage of stops made by the police department. Anytime that the blue bar is higher than the red bar, that's disproportionality. And so when you look through this, you say, well, there's a fair amount of disproportionality in a couple of these zones. So if you look at 30, for example, you can see that make sure here we are, I have to do it this way. So you can see that the blue bar is quite a bit higher than the red bar. You also see that right here in zone 27. But if I go back to the previous slide and you look, and you see zone 27, relatively few stops are made there, right? So all the lion's share of the stops are being made in zone 21. And if we look at the disproportionality there, you can see it's much lower. And this is what we found for all years of the data. Pretty much every time we look at Iowa City, we see this. In the areas where a lot of stops are being made, it tends to have lower levels of disproportionality, which is a good thing. I mean, that shows that, the areas where they're really concentrating their traffic enforcement, they have lower levels of disproportionality than the other areas. So zone 29 is the Broadway area right here. And get my mouse to work again. So zone 29 is right there. And there's relatively low disproportionality there. So in the two areas where a lot of stops are being made, the level of disproportionality is fairly low. And just to give you a highlight of what's coming, we found the same pattern in 2017. So 16 and 17 very similar in this way. And then nights. Here's nights. So you can see they made 10,000 stops on nights. They made about 2,500 on days. So they make a lot more stops during the night, but the pattern of where the stops are being made is very, very similar. And again, that's the same for 2017 also. And then the disproportionality. Again, we see, so there's disproportionality in zone 27 and 30 again, same as we saw before. And you'll want to pay attention to 21 because that's where most of the stops are being made at. Lower levels, comparatively lower levels of disproportionality in 21 and in 29. The two areas that we really look at closely, there's lower levels of disproportionality there. And if you go back, and so if you look at 30, you can see the bar is pretty small there on 30, so not too many traffic stops being made there.
But Dr. Bonham, and just to look at the two bar charts you have there, there seems to be a pretty clear difference in pattern from day to night in terms of disproportionality. The difference in police stops versus what you're expecting by the benchmarks is much greater at night, right?
I would say that there is more disproportionality at night. Yes, I think that's right. Especially in the areas where fewer stops are made. I'm really cautious about talking about disproportionality in areas where the numbers are a little bit lower because, with statistics, we really worry about the law of large numbers. So, there might be an element of sampling error there, but we do tend to see it year after year. So, yes, so there tends to be more disproportionality at night, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's harder to tell who's driving a car at night, for one thing. But for another thing, I think, and Captain can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think the younger officers tend to work at night. And they tend to be more aggressive, and that could lead to disproportionality, too, as well.
Could you clarify something in terms of this data? Do calls for service affect the stop at all, or are all of these situations where the officer makes a visual observation? If you could just explain.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So no, so we pull out the calls for service and those types of things. So these reflect officer-initiated stops.
One question I would have is, what are these stops for? Do you have that information?
Yes. So we track two broad categories of stops: moving violations versus equipment violations. I don't have a slide, but I can tell you essentially what it shows. Minority drivers, particularly African American drivers, tend to be stopped more for equipment violations at a higher rate than white drivers do, and the opposite is true then for moving violations. So, yeah, that's pretty typical what we find, and actually, in the other areas where we look to, in other communities, we tend to find the same patterns. And now, again, that can be due to a number of reasons. It could be a profiling issue, right? You're looking for a reason to stop a car, so you pick on an equipment violation, or it might be differences between driving populations in terms of the quality of the car based on socioeconomic factors or other things. So that's why this is a little tricky to make categorical statements that way. This just combines the data both day and night, and it shows a very similar pattern here. So these next few slides that I'm going to show you, I think, are more informative in terms of actually what's going on. And so we not only look at the department as a whole, we look at individual officers. Now, the data that I'm going to show you are de-identified, so you won't be able to tell who the officers are. I'm not even sure who they are. They come to me de-identified. So, well, actually, they come to me identified, and then I de-identify it. Just make sure I'm crystal clear on that. But then I forget it. So what we do is now we compute it essentially the same way for each individual officer. So we look at where the officer is making stops and the benchmark in the area where the officer is making stops, and then we compute the percentage of minority drivers stopped to the benchmark, divided by the percentage of white drivers stopped to the white benchmark, which is simply 1 minus the minority benchmark. That gives you a quasi-odds ratio measure, right? So, like, that's, if you want to think about it, it's like betting odds, 1 to 1 means even odds, right? So that's good. If you have a score of 1, that means based on the benchmarks and the percentages that should be stopped, that means that a white driver and a minority driver are equally likely to be stopped. As the scores increase, that's an indicator of disproportionality. So, for example, a score of 2 would mean that based on our benchmarks, that minority drivers are the odds are twice as great that minority drivers will be stopped in comparison to white drivers. You've got to be careful how you say that. It can change the meaning. But that's the correct way to say it. So the odds are twice as great that a minority driver will be stopped in comparison to a white driver. 3 times as likely, right? So larger scores are bad. And so what we do then is, keeping in mind that our data, our benchmark data are a sample, and so we worry about sampling issues, what we look at is what's called an internal benchmark, where we compare officers against each other. So officers, we can compare their scores against each other, and we can look at how many stops they made. And what we look for are officers who are different from the others. And that's indicative of perhaps a problem. So this just gives you that formula that I just talked about. We call it a disparity index. So this is the data from 2016, right here. So as you look at the data, if you look on the number of stops run up the y-axis, the vertical axis there. So as you move up that's a higher number of stops. As you look, you can see there's an officer that made 1,500 stops in that year. That's a lot of stops, by the way. And as you move on towards the right on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, that's the disparity index. So that bold red line is the median for the department, and then the little dashed line is the 90th percentile. So 90% of all the officers are below that line or less. So what we do then is we look for officers who are to the right of that line, because they would be different. And again, we talk about the law of large numbers. So that blue line that is horizontal is a benchmark of they made at least 100 stops. So we really don't pay too much attention to any officer that is under that 100 stop mark, because it really, especially if they're making stops in lots of different areas, that really could be sampling error. But once you get over 100 stops, the data become more stable. And so as you look at these data, and get my mouse to work here, you can see right here that we have an officer, this is an outlier with a high score. So that officer has a disparity index score of 6, and based on what I said, that would mean that the odds are 6 times as likely that an officer would stop a minority driver in comparison to a white driver, and is very different from the rest of the officers. So this is these are the types of things that we think are a little more revealing than the aggregate data, and what we like to do is track these types of data across longitudinally across a number of years. So I'm going to show you the same graph now for 2015. And you can see there's the same pattern. There's an officer here, right here, with a higher score, and that happens to be the same officer. So, obviously, the command staff knows about this. I think they're concerned about it. This was, I was brought down here for some training and talked to the officers about this, and so on and so forth. We look closely then when we get information like this at the second half of the study, which I'll talk about in a minute, the outcomes. So the outcome of the stop, right? So what can happen as a result of a stop? You can get a ticket, you can get a warning, you could maybe have your car searched, you could get arrested, right? So we look for then disproportionality among the officers that kind of stand out in these other areas. One thing we did find with this officer, there tended to be high levels of disproportionality in the outcomes as well. So this is an issue that I know Chief is concerned about, and so I think what I'll do here real quick is I'm going to jump ahead to the 2017 data of the individuals and show you that, rather than the aggregate stuff, which is very, very similar to 2016. But we'll go past the outcomes here and jump to it real quick. So these are the index values for 2017. And although there is an officer out here that has a relatively high score in comparison to the rest, it's not the same officer. That's a different officer. And the score, the values, if you look on the axis the x-axis, you can see that the scores are actually lower. They're down around 4 instead of 6. So, but this officer, the officer that's making a lot of stops, is constant across there. That officer has low levels of disproportionality. So 2015 and 16, we saw an officer with a high level of disproportionality. 2017, that officer's numbers, that officer now is one of the many dots instead of standing out amongst the others. So that's where that's at. So, any questions on that before I move on to the outcomes? This is the part that really I think is probably the heart of the report here.
I'm having a little trouble understanding the dotted red line, which I think you said was the median
that's the
disproportionality index, correct?
For the department.
For the department. And it seems to have increased from 2015 to 16 to 17.
You have a sharp eye. That's exactly
so that
right.
doesn't sound good to me. So.
No, and so that's why I think maybe that our benchmarks maybe are a little low. That's why we're really looking again. Maybe the driving population has changed, which would cause that line to shift. So you notice that all the officers, the grouping stayed the same. Mary, see, I mean, they're all kind of the same, but the line moved, which would indicate, it would be kind of unusual for everybody to stay the same and increase in their disproportionality. So I think maybe that our benchmarks are a little low. So that's why I say the takeaway isn't so much what the numbers are, the actual numbers are, but the pattern. It's the pattern that's important that you look at. But you're absolutely right. Yes, that the median value has creeped up every year. Yep, that's correct.
Are there any Department of Justice standards that can be identified that we should shoot for?
In terms of like these individual scores?
Well, disproportionality. I mean, have they identified any sort of that we can sort of link up with in terms of national standards?
Well, the problem with this part of the work is that in the literature and if you look at the Department of Justice, the big problem is the benchmark issue. Everybody knows that the benchmark is problematic. I think the way we do it here is about as good as you can get, actually watching the traffic, but admittedly, it's not perfect. And so, no, I guess to answer your questions, because the benchmark is so problematic, pretty much all research done in this area now is done on the outcomes. Because the outcomes, you don't have to worry about a benchmark. You just, now you have a closed data set, which are the stops, and you compare what's happening to the people who were stopped. So you don't need to worry about the benchmark. So that's pretty much where the research is at now. But really, the most important part of this, in my opinion, researchers should strive to do is get this front part right, because you can't get a ticket unless you're stopped, right? So, so the decision to make the stop is really, in my opinion, the most important part, but it's the hardest part. And so this isn't perfect, I guess that's the takeaway, that we could be wrong on our benchmarks. I don't think we're way off, but we could be a little bit off, which could explain numbers changing like that. But when I see a pattern where one officer is very different than others, that frankly is concerning.
I'd say last year, if I remember correctly, Chief Matherly indicated that he was taking these results seriously and was going to try to work with the police officers to get the disproportionality down, especially for at least one or maybe two or three officers who were pretty high far to the right on your graph.
Yeah.
And it sounds like he succeeded in that. Yeah. Okay, anyhow.
No, I would agree with that. I know he's taking it seriously. Based on my conversations, he's had me in to present the data. I present these same graphs to the officers. The officers know who these dots represent. I think they know what this means. If you're showing up in a spot where you shouldn't be, I mean, I hope they understand that. I'm pretty sure they do. So, yeah, I think... I really credit the Iowa City Department and the other departments around the state that are doing this, because they're really doing this on their own. They're sticking their necks out. Most departments won't do this. Several of them won't even talk to us. They don't want to know. And so this is really commendable by these departments that are doing it. So I really do applaud them because they really do care about it.
Do you have the, within these quadrants, very specific information in terms of where the stops are taking place, like a given intersection, things of that sort?
No. So I don't have access to the so the data I get doesn't have the XY coordinates, which are quasi longitude and latitude designations. So now mine are grouped by these areas. So the best we can do is the 1 mile area. So for example, the officer who was the outlier in the previous 2 slides happens to work in an area of town that has a relatively small area of high minority concentration, but he doesn't just work in that area. He works a large geographical area. And so the officer, what that indicates to me, is probably spending time in the area where the minority residency, the high minority residency is at. And when I speak to the officers, I always say, well, why do you do that? I mean, that's the question I ask. I get a variety of answers for that. Some, are better than others, but and it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate policing question. It's a question that the community should talk about. Do we want the officers in a certain area more than others, and so on and so forth. And then the second question I always ask the officers is, because typically the response I get is, well, I spend my time in the area where there's a lot of calls and types of calls that are, involve violent crime or maybe guns and stuff like that. And so what I ask is, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'll just throw out the question is, does traffic stops reduce that type of crime? Does doing a traffic stop reduce gun crime? And the literature isn't clear on that. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So it's a legitimate. It's something that I think really that's community stakeholders in the police. That's a good thing to talk about right there. That's where this type of work I really think should lead to, is that discussion.
Conversely, if we get the reduction in disproportionality, is there any empirical data on the reduction of crime in the sense of more community buy-in?
Yeah, none that I'm aware of. That's very interesting. No, I haven't seen where lowering levels of disproportionality has lowered violent crime. It may exist. I just haven't seen that literature, so I'm not aware of that.
In the cities you've worked, have you seen any patterns with respect to just the absolute numbers of stops go down?
Yes.
And what may be the reason for that?
So I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn to tell you that Davenport has had that issue. We work with Davenport. That's our home base. And they have seen a precipitous drop in the number of stops made since we've done the study, from 12,000 down to 6,000, roughly. And my personal opinion is that could be a morale issue on the police department. I think it could be, and again, I'm just giving you my opinion here, right? It could be that the officers are like, well, I'm out here working and my work's being scrutinized, so I just won't make any stops because of that crazy professor over there at St. Ambrose. So, and that concerns me, actually. I think that's something to really be concerned about. I talk a lot to the chief over there about that, and it is an issue. There's no question about it.
Because to me, I appreciate the focus of your research, which is not really looking at that issue, but that's to some degree where I'm coming from, is how can we just reduce the number of stops? I don't want it to be for the reason you were describing, but to the degree we can drop the number, whether it's improving our roadway design so that there's less likelihood that someone would be cited for a moving violation, getting all those equipment related stops handled in some other fashion. So we just drop the number of encounters by dropping the number of stops.
So when their stops drop there, now I haven't done their data for this year yet, the level of disproportionality remained relatively the same, but the absolute number of stops went down. So I think one area when anyone asks my advice about this, the police should shoot for is fairness. So what the police departments should try to get away from are the fishing expeditions where, okay, this guy looks suspicious to me. I don't really have any reason to stop him, but taillight's out, so I'm going to stop to find out who this guy is. And while I'm up there, maybe I'll ask him, can I search your car? You know, those types of things. So, which actually can be good police work in certain circumstances, but if you're doing it disproportionately to one group at the expense of another, that's bias. So that's the type of thing really that I would hope would come out of this, getting away from that sort of thing.
So I know Maz has a question she'd like to ask, and then I'm very conscious of the time.
I'm going to be very quick, really. I just want to, you brought very good point on Rockney, too, and that was all the time while you're reviewing, this was like my thinking. Maybe you cannot answer this question, but the police department can. When I saw the number of stops generally, I just find out that there is a lot of stops somewhere and low stops somewhere else across town, and I saw this is supposed to be equally everywhere if the police are going around town equally. That's giving me a sense that the police is spending more time somewhere else. So beside downtown, I guess, as you brought the Broadway, and they're spending more time there, which is not supposed to be. Why they spending more time there? That's my question. They supposed to be, the police supposed to be really driving equally around the city to make sure everywhere is okay. But just spending time in front of the minority people. That's why you're getting all this, stop for minorities, I guess. This is really good questions we want to ask the police department. Why the police is doing that? And I'm going to end up, this is biased too.
Sure.
Dr. Barnum can pull that map back up, but the areas where there are the majority of the stops, minority population aside, are also the arterial streets. So they're the downtown block, they're the block just north of downtown, so between downtown and Interstate 80 on Dubuque Street. It's the block south of downtown that you're traveling out. I don't disagree with what you're saying, council member, as far as certainly the Broadway area, and you're talking about minority population there, but the areas that he has pulled up here are basically the downtown area, the arterial streets approaching from the north from the interstate, the arterial streets going south from the downtown area down to Highway 6, and then Highway 6 where the highway's out east and west. So it's not just the neighborhoods, and I would disagree with you in that each neighborhood should have the same amount of stops, because there isn't the same amount of need for public safety enforcement for traffic control if there's 1,000 cars that are using any particular street downtown over a course of an hour, and there's 2 cars out in a particular outlying neighborhood that are using the streets for that same hour period. So it's driven also by a bunch of other things, volume of traffic, alcohol-related offenses, things like that. And what we're trying to do is make sure that what the chief is trying to do is make sure that it is being driven by public safety concerns and traffic concerns, and that it is not being driven by disproportionate minority contact. And where he's identifying that, or where he's even suspecting that, he's addressing it both on the officer level and with the redeployment of resources. In the remarks that I spoke to you about at the beginning, he talked about data-driven enforcement. One of the grants we're participating in is just that. One of our officers is tasked to the Justice Department and is trying to better allocate police resources, not just ours, but come up with a better model of allocating police resources that is data-driven, not just, boy, I think that this particular group of people or this particular neighborhood is involved more in crime, so therefore I'm going to go on the fishing expeditions that Dr. Barnum referred to. We are trying to move away from that, and we're trying to participate in programs that show us how to do that.
I don't know, but what I'm looking here is fairly enough, if I understand it right. 29 is south downtown, 13 is north downtown. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then what's the difference? You're telling me there is more traffic on the 29 zone
Correct.
than more traffic on the 13 zone?
There's more traffic on 29, 13, 30, and 28 than many, if not most, of the other blocks.
And there is more traffic on the west and the south than anywhere else around town beside I'm not talking about downtown, by the way, okay, because just leave the downtown alone. I'm talking only about south side and the other side, comparing like to the other side of the city. You're telling me in Iowa City, there only a lot of traffic at the south side of the city.
No, I'm not telling you that.
Then you have more stop here, and we have to look closely why we have more stop here. My guess is that, as he said earlier, if I understood him right, the police spend more time there. And why? That's the question. What do we have there so they can spend? We have minority people. That's the only thing that I know.
If I could, I think in the interest of time, it would be good if once Chief Matherly returns from recovering, if he could provide us with a short report addressing this question that Maz has raised, so that we can get a direct answer from the chief on it. I think it'd be very helpful. And your response was very good, Troy. But it's a good question. We need to understand the particulars involved. Dr. Barnum, you're doing a great job. I wonder if you could just kind of give us the punchline here.
Yeah, I can. So the punchline on the outcomes, and again, the outcomes are what happened to you as a result of the stop, is so citations, the level of disproportionality is decreasing. It's almost at 1 now, which means even there is no disproportionality. Arrests, so that number has come down over the years, as you can see from this graph. So the disproportionality in arrests is decreasing, so that's good. Search requests, there was some issues with the officer's understanding of what a search request was. I could spend a lot of time on that. I won't. Needless to say is now they do not mark their boxes as a search request when it really isn't one, and there's practically none of those. So a search request is when you ask somebody, can I search your car, without any probable cause. So that's gone away. That's a good thing. So these are some very positive issues. And then this last slide is the hit rates after a search. Those go up and down, which show there's no difference between racial groups in terms of whether you find something on a stop. So the bottom line then, if I was going to sum this all up, is that although the level of disproportionality looks like it might be creeping, we don't know if that's due to changes in the benchmark. That's why we're working hard to see that. And what we're really focusing on then are to see if we have any officers out there that are different from the other ones. So that's kind of where we focus our work. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you doing this good work for several years now.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Are we going to be able to see a version of this PowerPoint presentation? I mean, the full thing.
Sure. We can place it in the info packet.
I think if other council members agree, I think that'd be helpful.
Well,
I know we kind of compelled Chris to skip over a whole bunch of information there, and yet be helpful to have it in hand. Yeah.
I could just make a couple of quick comments. The data that you reviewed this year, 2016, 2017 data, Chief Matherly was hired in 17, in the beginning parts of 17, took some time to assess the issue, and I think has reported back to you on his plan to address this. It takes a while, and you can see the investment that's going in with officers, with training, with just reviewing this study in more detail than we ever have before with officers, so they can understand it, so that they can ask questions, so that they can learn from it. that is happening, and there's good open discussion. The chief mentioned in his memo an internal committee of police officers at all levels that are working on the DMC issue and coming up with ideas like bulbs. So the discussion is taking place daily within the walls of the department, and I really hope and expect to see that as that investment in training pays off and that investment in just focusing on this issue pays off, you're going to continue to see improvements, not only in the numbers, but you're going to see improvements in the strategies we deploy. You're going to see more community policing efforts. Hopefully you already are seeing that this past year or two. But all that's going to pay, and I expect that as we continue to do this study, you're going to see that bear fruit in these results.
Okie doke. So it's 6:30 now. We can get going on the next topic. I don't know how far we'll be able to get, though. So we have a pre-budget kickoff discussion, and we've already blown a hole in our time budget. So, Ashley, do you want to lead us through this?
Sure. Essentially, we're just looking for feedback from council if there are any comments or projects, programs, services that staff should start examining or thinking about including in the upcoming budget planning process. We start our staff discussions with capital projects and then move on to operational expenses and other city budget items later in the fall. And so I just wanted to quickly summarize our mid-year budget work session, I guess, or activity that we put on earlier this month. Council had asked for some additional opportunities for the public to participate in our budget processes, and staff took the idea from last January's Breakfast on a Budget morning activity prior to the major work session on the budget and ran with it. So we held a chip-in event, which was engaged about 50 residents from Iowa City and gave a quick presentation on just the status of the budget and some things that we think about when we're preparing the budget, and then had them participate in a prioritization activity. They voted with chips based on strategic plan goal items, and we had maps plastered on the walls so that people could circle or make comment on the maps, identifying areas that needed improvement. And we also had an area for them to submit specific comments and ideas. So it was a busy night and we got a lot of feedback. We also had an online platform. We received almost 600 responses. So there were over 900 so open-ended responses that I'm still working through as comments for what people would like to see. So I did give you a summary in the packet. The top three, though, we identify the strategic plan top goals, and so what the people who have participated indicated to us their top goals were advancing social justice and racial equity was number one as a ranking. We had fostering healthy neighborhoods throughout the city of Iowa City. That's our strategic goal number 3. And then number 1 was promoting a strong and resilient local economy. That ranked 3rd. So I'll just note those couple. We also have overall our general feedback, what we received from residents who participated in person and in the online survey. Top areas of focus they'd like to see streets and infrastructure, really taking a focus on our streets. Same with public transportation improvements. So these ranged in the comments from bus transportation to bicycle facilities. We wanted to encourage equitable and sustainable economic growth. So working on exactly what areas they're trying to target. Affordable housing is a big issue. Supporting education and workforce programs was in the top 5. Council's been mentioning that, and that continued to be something that the participants were interested in seeing more of. Building and promoting a livable community for all people goes back to our social justice item. Supporting small business and entrepreneurs, connecting to our strong local economy goal. historic preservation, supporting a reduction in consumption of goods, and minimizing solid waste. Spoke to our climate action and environmental goals, strategic plan number 6. And then supporting organizations helping those with trauma and crisis. So that was just the top 10 that were submitted by people in person and online. And we've got the whole packet of information if you really wanted to dig deep into specific responses. But I figured I'd give you an overall sense of what people are interested in, and then we verbatim provided all comments. So you can spend hours reading through if you like. That's what I'm doing, and pairing the locations that people identified as needing improvement with things that we can address. Some of them might be quick turnaround. We might be able to just address them with staff. If people say fix a pothole in this area, or I hope we plant trees in a park that we're planning to improve already, then we'll be taking care of some of those things. But anything major we'll come back to you, or you might spot something that catches your eye and let us know. So I think the thought was to request any projects or ideas that you had during this time. I don't know if we have time to do that right this minute or not, but that's the sense of our mid-year efforts. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry we did chew up some time there.
I was here for the chip-in and thought it was a great event. But in hindsight, and looking at this voluminous report that you've put together, one of the things that did occur to me, if we're really trying to get input from the public on the budget and how they want money spent, then I think any effort to get that input should somehow give them options on all the kinds of expenses we have. And so the in-person thing really only gave them an opportunity to comment on strategic goals. And so I think it listed certain things underneath those. Our action items, I think, underneath those. But, if you think about any of the other services, whether it's streets or police or fire, just kind of if you will, the ordinary everyday services that we're always providing, but we are allocating a significant amount of money out of our general fund to provide. It's focusing only on the strategic planning goals didn't really give them an opportunity to say, hey, maybe I don't care about any one of those strategic plans. I want you to spend all that extra money on the streets or whatever. So that's the only particular comment I would have, is just more of an opportunity to look at the whole budget in a digestible way. Some kind of major categories, obviously, so they could put their chips. Because I guess what my thought is, I wouldn't want people to think that because they voted for certain strategic planning initiatives that they don't care about those other things. They weren't given those options on the in-person. So I didn't think of it that night. It just kind of came to me as I looked through this afterwards.
Yeah, we tried to cover that there was 3 stations, and there was kind of open-ended station, and then there was the map, and then there was the strategic priorities.
I think it's a great initiative, and I know in a meeting we had at some other point, at least one of our council members praised staff for inventing this chip-in idea. So it's a great initiative. But one thing I'm conscious of, though, is that anything that involves voluntary participation on the part of residents automatically means there's self-selection involved. So that basically biases things in unknown directions because of that self-selection. So I don't mean that as criticism. I just think it's a fact at hand. I was struck by the residents' or participants' attention to basically roads, and improving the condition of roads and sidewalks, I guess, but mainly roads. And boy, that's not a new topic, but I think it clearly is something we need to try to pay more attention to in the forthcoming budget. Who knows yet what's really possible, but if we could ramp up that, the resurfacing budget some more and target the streets that are in the greatest need, that would really be helpful.
Now that Dubuque Street will be done.
Yeah, we're hoping it will be done. Yeah. And another thing that comes to my mind, and you all surely have your own views about various things, is I think we need to be considering the possibility of adding staff. I know it's expensive. Each staff person costs, I don't know, $100,000 approximately per year. Not in terms of salary, but in terms of salary and benefits, etc. But, Jeff, you have several times in the past indicated that there are certain departments that are really feeling very stressed, mainly because they haven't had any additions to staff, or maybe they've had reductions over the years, and yet expectations in terms of workload have increased pretty substantially. So I think we need to at least consider that possibility of adding staff for a few key departments. And I'm thinking of Public Works, I'm thinking of Parks and Recreation, because you've named them before, maybe others. I'm also thinking, we got recommendations from our bicycle master plan and the climate action and adaptation plan to hire half-time people for those activities. We should, at a minimum, at least consider the possibility of having half-time people take on key responsibilities. I'm not saying we got to do it, but I think we should consider those possibilities. We could spend another 3 or 4 minutes on this if any of you have any.
Well, I just wanted to briefly comment on the chip-in. Obviously, with any public participation, there's always difficulty in terms of a lot of things that the public doesn't see on a day-to-day basis in terms of the competing priorities. But that said, I'm really viewing this process as sort of our initial pilot to try to get this process in.
Yeah.
And all I'm really looking for is that even though there was a self-selecting process, hopefully we can do some additional outreach, that we can maybe pick 1 or 2 trend lines and then come back and say, in a meaningful way, this was affected by the public participation, because a lot of times people thank us for spending the money, and I think, why do you thank us? It's your money, right? We're just the trustees for that, and it is their money, and so I think to get that input and for them to say, hey, this resulted from that process, I think would be really helpful.
Thanks.
I think as Jim talked about the roads, I saw that, and then also with public transportation improvements. I think a lot of these responses, of the 600 online responses, really highlighted some of the things we've talked about that we need to do and that we're planning to do. So I think increasing the budget for the roads, and then with the transportation study and looking at that, and hopefully, if we need to, putting more money into the different routes and more buses. So I think that was important.
At some point, that seems to be in the works, but we'll have to see the results of the transit study to have a clear idea about that.
Right.
Yeah, it caused me to think about terms of toolkits, kind of this question of how it's so difficult to prioritize budget. But if we had, as we do with equity, an equity toolkit, if we had a toolkit related to sustainability, to questions of livability, which all, of course, would need to be defined. It's a very broad concept, but how do we look at these things in terms of achieving these goals? What would be, the most cost-effective way of implementing them?
Okay.
Any other comments?
If I could just wrap up with, if council members have specific projects that you want us to consider as staff going into the budget, if you could let me know, I can always aggregate those and report back to you so you know what everybody is offered. But it is a lot easier for us to make those considerations in September and October than it is in January and February. And I know things change and something's going to come up in January that you can't anticipate now, but to the extent that you can anticipate those, please forward those on to me in the next couple of weeks, and I'll aggregate them. I'll push them back to you all. You can decide if you want to discuss them more or not, but that's really helpful for us.
All right, we're going to have to disband our happy crew briefly here. We're going to have to come back to this after the formal meeting, right? So we will pick up with the possibility of increasing hourly staff wages and then move on to the rest of the work session agenda after our formal meeting. Okay, so we're done for now. I know a few people just walked in. We're having a work session. We just stopped the work session. The formal meeting begins at 7 p.m., so we're going to take a 15-minute break. Yeah.
Coming up, we give you a major update in the disappearance of Molly Tibbetts.
And later on this Tuesday morning edition of DITV News, City Council candidates speak to the community.
Coming up in sports, we hear from the new Iowa softball coach.
And we get updates from Iowa volleyball team as they prepare for their upcoming season.
Rainy skies for a few more days, but no worries. The warm weather will arrive just in time for the weekend. Find out more on weather.
All those stories and more coming up on this Tuesday morning edition of DITV News.
Don't click away. It all starts now. Good morning and thank you for tuning in. I'm Anthony Caligari.
And I'm Becca Scadden. We began this broadcast with breaking news. This just in, multiple major news outlets are reporting that officials believe they found the body of missing University of Iowa student Molly Tibbetts.
The Department of Criminal Investigation will be holding a press conference at 5 p.m. to talk about this major update. Please note that the body found has not been confirmed as Molly Tibbetts until further DNA testing. Check on
DailyIowan.com and the Daily Iowan's Twitter at the Daily Iowan as this case unfolds. We'll have updates from tonight's news conference tomorrow morning. Now, Iowa City Council candidates are gearing up for council elections at the beginning of October.
With a lot to discuss with community members before the upcoming election, DITV News reporter Susanna Kloster went to the event. She is live in the newsroom. Susanna, what can you tell us about this conversation between the public and the candidates?
Well, guys, the 2018 City Council election candidates engaged with Iowa City residents to share what makes Iowa City so great and what changes they're hoping to implement in our community. Taking questions from community members, locals got to get a sample of what candidates are hoping for.
Council election candidates addressed community members about what their goals are if they were elected.
Imagine if Iowa City, we had a society where people felt safe. There was access to clean water and food, and housing, education, healthcare, and livable wages.
This conversation session was hosted by Coffee with Dan, a longtime resident of Iowa City who wanted to have an engaged inquiry with the community that creates a space for a thoughtful experience. Candidates